The year was 1887, and the silence of the Dakota plains was a living thing. For Cora Donovan, it was a predator. It had stalked her for 2 winters and a summer, ever since she had buried her husband, Arthur, on the small rise behind their cabin. It was a silence that had teeth, chewing away the memories of laughter and leaving only the hollow ache of what was gone. The land itself, a vast, unforgiving expanse of dun-colored grass under a sky too wide and empty, felt less like a home and more like a tombstone for a life she had once dreamed of. Cora's days were carved into a severe and unyielding routine. She rose before the sun painted the eastern horizon in pale, watery colors. She split wood with an economy of motion that belied the searing pain in her shoulders, the axe falling with a grim, rhythmic finality. She tended her meager garden, her hands chapped and raw from the soil and the wind. She mended clothes that no one but her would ever wear again, her stitches small and tight, as if she could sew up the fraying edges of her own existence. Her world had shrunk to the 4 log walls of the cabin, the plot of turned earth, and the lonely grave marked by a simple wooden cross. Grief was not a spectre that visited in the night. It was the very air she breathed, the ground beneath her feet. It had a weight, a physical presence that bowed her spine and etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth. She had been 24 when Arthur's heart had simply given out, and in the 2 years since, she felt she had aged a lifetime. The loss was twofold, a wound within a wound. First Arthur, and 6 months before him, their infant son, taken by a fever that had swept through him like a prairie fire. She rarely visited the smaller, unmarked patch of earth beside his father's grave. The silence there was the most unbearable of all. She had hardened herself to survive. Her heart, once a wellspring of easy affection, had become a fortress of ice, its walls built brick by brick from sorrow and solitude. She spoke to no one, save for the horse in the lean-to and the chickens in their coop. Her trips to the nearest settlement, a full day's ride away, were infrequent and brief. She would trade her eggs and any surplus vegetables for flour, salt, and coffee, her words clipped and functional, her eyes avoiding the gazes of others. They saw a grim-faced widow, too young to be so broken, and whispered their pity or their judgment when she turned her back. She felt their stares like brands on her skin, but refused to give them the satisfaction of her tears. One afternoon in late autumn, the sky turned the color of a deep bruise. A wind rose from the north, howling like a thing grieving, carrying the first sharp bite of the coming winter. It rattled the single glass pane in her window and moaned in the eaves of the cabin. Cora was inside, stoking the fire in the stone hearth, when a sound, distinct from the wail of the wind, made her freeze. It was a faint, rhythmic thudding against her door. Her first thought was of a wolf, or perhaps a dying buffalo, but the sound was too deliberate. Fear, a cold and familiar companion, coiled in her stomach. No one came to her door. No one ever came. She took the heavy iron poker from its stand beside the fire, its weight a small comfort in her hand. Her knuckles were white as she gripped it. The thudding stopped, replaced by a soft, scraping sound, and then silence. Only the wind answered. She waited, her breath held tight in her chest, for what felt like an eternity. The silence from outside was now more menacing than the noise had been. Steeling herself, she moved to the door, her steps soundless on the worn floorboards. She lifted the heavy wooden bar that secured it and pulled it inward just a crack. The wind tore at the opening, trying to shove its way inside. Through the sliver of grey light, she saw nothing at first. Then her eyes adjusted, and she saw it. A small shape huddled on her porch, half covered by a dusting of the first snow. It was a child, an Indian child. He was lying on his side, his small body curled against the cold. He wore buckskin leggings and a thin tunic, wholly inadequate for the sudden, vicious turn in the weather. His face, turned toward the door, was flushed with an unnatural heat, his black hair matted to his forehead with sweat despite the freezing air. As she watched, a tremor ran through his small frame. Cora's mind raced, a torrent of fear and prejudice warring with a deeply buried instinct. She knew the stories. She had heard the talk in town about the Dakota, their lands shrinking, their people starving, their resentment a simmering pot threatening to boil over. To take him in was to invite trouble she could not possibly handle. They would come looking for him. They would see her, a lone white woman, and assume the worst. They might burn her cabin, or worse. The safe thing, the sensible thing, was to close the door, bar it, and pretend she had seen nothing. But the boy moaned, a thin, desolate sound that cut through the howl of the wind and pierced the icy walls of her heart. His eyes, dark and glassy with fever, fluttered open for a moment, but they were unseeing. He was so small, smaller even than she remembered her own son being, though he was clearly older. The sight of his suffering, so naked and absolute, overrode everything else. It was a sight she knew too well. With a strangled sob that was more anger than sorrow, she swung the door wide. "Damn it all," she whispered to the wind, to God, to the ghost of her husband. She set the poker down, bent, and scooped the boy into her arms. He was lighter than he looked, a fragile bundle of burning heat and shivering limbs. She carried him inside, kicking the door shut against the storm, and the silence of her cabin was broken. She laid him on the braided rug before the fire, the warmest place in the cabin. Her hands trembled as she untied the leather thongs of his tunic. His skin was dry and scorching to the touch. On his chest and arms, she saw them, the faint, rose-colored spots that she recognized with a sickening lurch of her stomach. She had seen them once before in the settlement, on a child who had not lived to see the next spring. Smallpox, the Red Plague. Panic seized her, cold and sharp. This was not just a fever, this was a death sentence, for him and likely for her. She backed away from the boy, her hand flying to her mouth. Her carefully constructed solitude was not just a defense against sorrow, it was a defense against this very thing, against the chaos and disease of the world outside her door, and she had just invited it in. She looked at the boy, his breathing shallow and rapid, and then at her own hands, the hands that had touched him. It was too late. A wave of fatalistic calm washed over her. What did it matter? Her life was already a ghost of what it should have been. If she was to die, what difference did it make if it was from loneliness or from this? But the boy was still fighting. She spent the next hour in a flurry of purposeful activity, the old, forgotten instincts of a caregiver taking over. She moved her own narrow cot from the corner and placed it beside the hearth. Gently, she lifted the boy onto it. She filled a basin with cool water from the barrel and found a clean linen cloth. For 7 days and 7 nights, that small cabin became a battleground. The world outside ceased to exist. There was only the roaring fire, the moaning wind, and the child's ragged breaths. His name, she learned in a fleeting moment of lucidity on the 3rd day, was Wapasha. He had whispered it, his voice a dry rasp, his eyes briefly clearing to reveal a flicker of awareness, of fear. Wapasha, she had repeated softly, her voice hoarse from disuse. "You are safe, Wapasha. You rest now." She did not know if he understood her words, but the terror in his eyes seemed to recede, replaced by a weary resignation. The first few days were a blur of thankless, terrifying work. She bathed his burning body, trying to bring the fever down. She coaxed spoonfuls of broth and water between his cracked lips, most of which dribbled back out. The rash bloomed, turning from spots to raised pustules, and the foul odor of the sickness filled the small space. She did not flinch. She cleaned him, changed the bedding, and kept the fire roaring, fighting the encroaching chill that seemed to emanate from the disease itself. In the long dark hours of the night, when the boy's delirium was at its worst, she found herself talking to him. The words, dammed up for 2 years, began to flow in a trickle, then a stream. She told him about Arthur, about his strong hands and his quiet smile. She told him about their journey west, filled with hope that now seemed like a cruel joke. And then, hesitantly, she spoke of the one she never spoke of. "I had a son, too," she murmured, her voice catching as she sponged Wapasha's brow. "His name was Thomas. He had hair as fine as corn silk. He didn't stay long." The admission hung in the air, a fragile, shimmering thing. It was the first time she had said his name aloud since the day she had wrapped him in his christening gown and laid him in the cold earth. Tending to Wapasha became a penance and a prayer. Every cloth she dipped, every spoonful of water she offered, was an act of atonement for the child she could not save. She saw Thomas's face in the sleeping boy's features, felt the memory of his small, warm body in the weight of Wapasha in her arms. The ice around her heart began to crack. She was no longer just a widow surviving. She was a woman fighting for a life, not her own, but his. It was a purpose, sharp and clear and agonizing. She stopped thinking about the danger to herself. His survival was the only thing that mattered. On the morning of the 7th day, she awoke slumped in the chair beside the cot, her neck stiff, her body aching with a profound exhaustion. The cabin was quiet, too quiet. A leaden dread filled her. She looked at the boy. He was still, his chest not moving. "No," she breathed, scrambling to her feet. She leaned over him, her ear close to his mouth. Nothing. Then she saw it, a faint, fluttering rise and fall of his chest. His breathing was no longer ragged and shallow, but deep and even. She touched his forehead. The fire was gone. His skin was cool, damp with a healthy sweat. The fever had broken. A wave of relief so powerful it buckled her knees washed over her. She sank back into the chair, tears finally streaming down her face, not tears of grief, but of a fierce, exhausted triumph. He would live. The pustules had begun to dry, and though he would be scarred, he would live. She watched him sleep for a long time, a real, healing sleep. As the sun climbed higher, a deep chill settled into her bones, a cold that had nothing to do with the temperature of the room. A tremor started in her hands. She tried to stand, to add another log to the fire, but her legs wouldn't obey. Her head swam, and the edges of the room blurred. She knew, with a certainty that was absolute, what was happening. The disease, having been vanquished from the boy's body, had found a new home in hers. The next few hours passed in a haze of rising fever. She managed to drag herself to her own bed in the far corner of the cabin, pulling the quilts over her shaking body. The world began to distort. The familiar log walls seemed to ripple and sway. The fire in the hearth roared like a dragon. She was thirsty, so thirsty, but she couldn't move. Sometime later, she was vaguely aware of movement. Wapasha was awake. He had pushed himself up on the cot, his dark eyes, now clear and intelligent, fixed on her. He looked small and frail, a ghost of a child, but he was alive. He saw her shivering, heard the moan that escaped her lips. Fear returned to his face, but it was a different kind of fear now. It was for her. He slid off the cot, his legs unsteady. He stumbled to the water barrel, filled a dipper with shaking hands, and brought it to her. She tried to drink, but her teeth chattered against the metal rim, and the water spilled down her chin. He watched her, his expression a mixture of childish helplessness and a solemn understanding far beyond his years. He knew this sickness. He knew what it did. He knew she had taken it from him. He touched her hand, a small, cool pressure on her burning skin. He said something in his own language, the words soft and liquid. Then, with a resolve that seemed to fill his small frame, he turned and went to the door. He paused for a moment, looking back at her, his dark eyes promising a return. Then he slipped out into the vast, snowy world, leaving her to the mercy of the fever. Cora drifted. Time lost all meaning, stretching and compressing in a delirious tide. She was tossed on waves of heat and cold, haunted by fragmented dreams. She saw Arthur's face, then Thomas's, then the solemn eyes of the Dakota boy. Sometimes she was burning in a desert, Other times she was freezing in a blizzard. She was dimly aware of her own mortality, of her body failing. She had saved the boy, and it had cost her everything. There was a strange peace in the thought. She had not died of loneliness after all. She had died for a reason. She let go, sinking into the darkness, the roar of the fever, a final, consuming fire. She floated back to consciousness slowly, as if from a great depth. The first thing she registered was sound, a low, rhythmic sound, like a deep heartbeat. It was a drum. The second was smell. Not the foulness of sickness, but the clean, sharp scent of sage and something else, something earthy and unknown. The third was presence. The cabin was full. Her eyelids felt as if they were weighted with stones. With a monumental effort, she forced them open. The light in the cabin was dim, filtered. The fire was banked low. And surrounding her bed, standing in a silent, solemn circle, were people. They were Dakota, warriors and old men, their faces etched with the deep lines of hardship and wisdom. They were tall and imposing, their presence filling every inch of the small room, yet they were utterly still. There were 12 of them. They were not looking at her with malice or anger. Their gazes were intense, focused, imbued with a profound gravity. She saw Wapasha standing near the foot of the bed, nestled beside a tall, powerfully built man whose face was a mask of stoic grief and gratitude. The man's eyes met hers, and in their depths she saw the boy's same dark, intelligent gaze. This was his father. Fear tried to surface, but she was too weak to sustain it. This was not a raiding party. This was something else entirely. The man, who she would later know as Chaitin, gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod. At this signal, the men began to chant. It was not a sound of war, but a sound of power. It was a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floorboards, through the very bones of the cabin. It rose and fell in cadence with the single, steady drum beat. It was a sound as old as the plains, a language of the earth itself. They were not speaking to her, but for her. They were holding a vigil. The hours, or perhaps days, that followed were a waking dream. The 12 healers of Chaitin's band, their greatest spiritual authorities, had come. They had followed the small, desperate tracks of a boy who had walked for a day and a night to bring them back. They had found the woman who had traded her life for his, and they had decided to intervene. It was a debt that must be honored. They worked in shifts. One would burn herbs in an abalone shell, wafting the fragrant smoke over her with an eagle feather. Another would touch her forehead, her chest, her hands, murmuring prayers in their soft, guttural tongue. They brewed teas from roots and leaves they had brought with them, concoctions that were bitter and strange, and gently lifted her head to help her drink. Wapasha, his strength slowly returning, would sit by her side, his small hand often resting on her arm, a constant, anchoring presence. Cora drifted between consciousness and the fevered lands of her mind. In her lucid moments, she watched them. She saw the intricate beadwork on their shirts, the feathers tied in their long, graying hair. She saw the deep concentration on their faces, the absolute focus they brought to their task. There was no judgment in their eyes for the color of her skin, for the world she represented. In this small, sacred space, she was not a white settler, an outsider, an enemy. She was a life, balanced on a knife's edge, and they were the collective will pushing her back toward the side of the living. Chaitin rarely left the cabin. He stood like a sentinel, his arms crossed, his gaze unwavering. One evening, when the fever had lessened its grip and she could keep her eyes open for more than a few minutes, he came and sat on the stool beside her bed. "He is my son," Chaitin said, his voice a low rumble. His English was clear, learned from traders and treaties. "My only son." He did not need to say more. In that simple statement, Cora heard the echo of her own loss, the chasm that had opened in her own life. "He is a good boy," she whispered, her voice a fragile thread of sound. Chaitin nodded, a deep and solemn movement of his head. "You have a strong heart," he said. It was not a compliment. It was a statement of fact, an observation made by a man who knew the nature of spirits. You fought the sickness for him. Now we fight it for you. The sickness raged, but it met a wall of resistance it could not breach. It was not just the herbal remedies and the cool cloths. It was the unyielding presence of the 12 men, the ceaseless rhythm of the drum, the power of the ancient chants that filled the cabin and seemed to fortify its very walls against the intrusion of death. They were weaving a shield of communal energy, of spiritual force, around her. They were giving her their strength. Slowly, painstakingly, she began to mend. The fire in her blood cooled to embers, then to ash. The delirium receded, leaving behind a profound weakness, but a clear mind. The day came when she awoke, and the air was clean, the only scent that of the wood smoke from the hearth. The chanting had stopped. The cabin was empty, save for two. Chaitan sat in the chair, watching her. Wapasha was asleep on his rug by the fire, his small body finally relaxed in deep, untroubled rest. Cora pushed herself up on her elbows. The world held steady. The weakness was there, a great, heavy blanket, but the sickness was gone. Chaitan saw her move and stood. He came to the bed and looked down at her, his face unreadable for a moment. Then, the stern lines of his expression softened, just slightly. "The spirit has chosen to stay with you," he said. She looked around the quiet cabin. It felt larger, hollowed out by the absence of the others. "They're gone?" "Their work is done," he answered. He gestured to the small table beside her bed. There was a pouch of cured meat, a bundle of dried herbs, and a small, intricately carved wooden bird. "We do not forget Adept." Tears welled in her eyes, tears of a kind she had never known before. They were not for sorrow or relief, but for a grace so profound and unexpected it left her speechless. She who had walled herself off from the world had been saved by the very people she had been taught to fear. She, who believed she was utterly alone, had been surrounded by a community that had claimed her as one of their own to protect. Chaitan called to his son. Wapasha woke and came to stand beside his father, looking at Cora with shy reverence. He reached out and touched her hand, the one that had held the dipper of water for him. His skin was smooth and cool. "Thank you," he said, the English words careful and practiced. Cora squeezed his hand, a strength she didn't know she possessed flowing into her arm. "And you," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you, Wapasha." They left soon after. She watched from the doorway, wrapped in a quilt, as the tall warrior and the small boy walked away across the snow-covered plains, their figures shrinking against the vast white canvas of the land until they were gone. The silence that returned to the cabin was different. It was no longer a predator. It was a space for reflection, filled with the resonant echo of the drumbeat, the memory of the chants. The grief for Arthur and Thomas was still there, a part of her soul's landscape, but it was no longer the only feature. Beside it, something new had been planted, a strange and resilient seed of hope. In the weeks that followed, as her strength returned, she found that she was not truly alone. Every few days, a package would be left on her porch, a brace of rabbits, a skin of fresh water, a bundle of firewood already cut. She never saw who left them, but she knew. It was a quiet, continued watchfulness, a thread of connection that stretched across the empty plains. The land no longer seemed like a tombstone. When she looked out her window, she saw not an empty void, but the horizon where her saviors had disappeared. The wind no longer howled with grief. It carried the faint, imagined sound of a drum, a reminder that resilience was not just about enduring alone, but about the unexpected, unasked for kindness that can bridge any divide. Her heart, once a fortress of ice, had been melted by a fire, not of sickness, but of a grace she would carry with her for the rest of her days. She had opened her door to a dying child and, in doing so, had found her own way back to the world of the living.